Join the Santa Clarita Valley Veterans Memorial Committee at Eternal Valley Cemetery for a Memorial Day tribute to our veterans, current and past. The tribute includes a flyover, the ROTC drill team, and music from the Santa Clarita Valley Concert Band. Afterward, gather at the Veterans Memorial Wall for a reading of the more than 800 names.
From the state capitol, Capitol Ideas with Senator George Runner. And now, Capitol Ideas.
Welcome to Capitol Ideas. I'm Senator George Runner. As most of you know by now, California's budget is once again in deep red ink, to the tune of $8 billion and probably even more. Interestingly enough, California's tax revenue continues to grow year after year. I like to point out the fact that since I've been to Sacramento 10 years ago, the budget has grown from $50 billion to over $100 billion. It seems to me taxpayers are surely doing their part to keep the state afloat. So what's the problem? For years, those liberals who have controlled the legislature have spent more than we take in. And some of our governors have signed onto budgets that just continue to spend more and more money. It's a bad habit that continues to this day. So instead of reining in spending and to cover up years of overspending, many of my Democrat colleagues are now hoping to just raise taxes, or as they say, eliminate loopholes. But keep in mind, these tax loopholes are really tax credits that families like yours and mine or businesses take to operate, and especially in underserved areas for those businesses. Here with me to talk about tax credits is Jon Coupal of the Jarvis Taxpayers Association. Thanks, Jon, for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Let's go ahead and talk specifically about this idea of the budget growth or the revenue growth in the state of California. I talked a moment ago about the fact that since I've been here, it's going from about $100 billion or $50 billion to $100 billion, 10 short years. And, I can't, when we get into these discussions and we sit around the budget table and talking about what we need to do, oftentimes my colleagues who are trying to wring their hands, trying to figure out how to keep a lot of these programs going, blame things like Prop 13, saying, oh, if we just did, voters just didn't do Prop 13, or they'll say if the governor, when he first got here, if he didn't just eliminate that car tax, then we wouldn't have this problem. But yet, revenues seem to just be still flowing into the state of California.
Well, at the end of the day, the legislature, dominated by the tax and spend lobby, really will spend every dollar that we send them. And we've been sending them increasingly amounts of taxpayer dollars in the last 30 years. Since Proposition 13 passed in 1978, and we're coming on the 30th anniversary of Prop 13, government revenues have exceeded all other economic inflation factors and population increases.
So what you're saying there is if you take inflation, plus then new residents in the state of California, new births, new people coming, our revenues have still outgrown those issues.
Vastly. Here's one fact, particularly as it relates to education, that really stuns the other side. They always say that Prop 13 killed good education in the state of California, but I think the best response from us is simply to point out that we are now spending 30% more on a per-student inflation-adjusted basis than we were just prior to Proposition 13's passage. And those were the days, those were the glory days of California education, if you listen to the other side, when everything was perfect. Oh, if we could only go back to those days before Prop 13. Well, we are now spending today 30% more on an inflation-adjusted per-student basis, and yet we're not getting the product. Well, it's not a revenue problem, it is a spending problem.
And then back to the end, in terms of the education issue again, and we need to be looking for outcomes. One of the issues that we're pointing out right now and that I talk to my friends about when we talk about education spending, because surely that's a priority for us in the state of California. However, at some point we need to be looking at what we're getting for the tax dollars that people are paying. 6 years ago, if we were to go ahead and actually put into next year's budget what is kind of the online amount that would be under Prop 98 the voters passed, we'd be increasing education spending over the last 6 years by about $11–12 billion over the last 6 years alone, and yet we have 75,000 less students during that same period of time. So again, you're seeing lots of new money going in, But yet somewhere along the line, we're not seeing the product because nobody can now point to this long list of higher test scores or lower dropout rates or smaller class sizes as a result of all that new revenue.
And of course, the programs that we do know that work, like school choice, charter schools, more flexibility to give parents, to empower parents as to where they send their kids. Of course, the same people who spend all the money will be the first to stand in line saying, no, we can't do that, because as you and I both know, unfortunately, the labor interests in Sacramento really dominate, and they want to protect their pots of the pie. It is not for the children. It is really for their own bureaucracies. We would really like to see outcome-based budgeting and see what are the programs that work. You can bet that if parents were given the amount of money we spend per student, they could go out and buy a very good educational product.
Well, you know, the thing that makes it challenging around here in this building, and you've seen for many years, is that as we talk about these programs and now as we talk about the fact that there's adjustments to spending that needs to take place, you know, no one parades up, you know, the whole host of state bureaucrats or the host of all the list of state laws that we put into place to drive up costs.
Right.
What we end up seeing is little children, those with disabilities, the elderly, and say, oh, if you don't do this, these are the people who are going to be hurt.
Right. Well, this is a classic example, of course, of the Washington Monument Syndrome, where at the federal level, they threaten to shut down the Washington Monument when the federal government is at budgetary impasse. And it is a tactic of the other side. I think what we need to do, fiscally responsible opinion leaders and elected leaders, need to point out where we are wasting the money. Again, getting back to education. You're very familiar with the battles that the politicians in Sacramento will not allow local school districts to contract out transportation, food service, or lawn maintenance. Local school districts could save tens of millions of dollars if we pass those simple laws merely to empower local school districts, and yet they won't do it. That's money that could be going for the children, and yet they won't do it. And those are the examples that we need to bring forward and say, if these guys were serious about being for the children, they would pass those kinds of laws.
Well, and again, even when they are doing those kinds of small construction projects along at the school district, I remember talking to one of my superintendents about a shade structure that they were wanting to build over an eating area.
Right.
And the extreme cost that was having, because under current law, again, we have this very high, what we call prevailing wage requirement.
Right.
And so instead of going out and just having a bid and saying, let's find the cheapest way that we can do this, again, we can go ahead and, obviously we have to pay certain wages by the state law, but instead we have this really high prevailing wage requirement, which made that incredibly expensive in order to build just a shade area, because again, it's not like it's a competitively built bid project. You're required to pay this highest wage.
Yeah, we were talking about the operational expenses of education, and now we're drifting into the capital expenditures. The waste, fraud, and abuse in the capital side of building our schools is tremendous. We could be getting about 50% more dollars for the building if we got rid of some of these regulations, but again, we can't. So I think taxpayers need to understand that they are doing their part. Taxpayers are giving Sacramento enough money. It's just that our elected leaders are not spending it the right way.
Well, and again, it goes beyond just, again, we're using schools as an example, but the problem is this is what permeates through all of government, is this higher cost to do business. In another part of my district, we're short courtrooms, but yet we have a new courthouse that has a whole level that's empty. And so it was built in order to expand.
Right.
And so what they found, though, is that each one of those courtrooms, again, the building's already built, heating and air conditioning's already there, everything's there, but to actually physically build a new courtroom is $2 million. And again, the building's already there, the parking lot's already there, the infrastructure's already there. That's just the inside. Yeah. And it's because of these extremely high wages that the law requires them to pay. In fact, they were actually saying it was cheaper for them to bring on a modular as for a courtroom than it was to actually build out the inside of a courtroom in this existing facility.
That's right. That's right. And we know that government generally operates by different rules that the private sector would never tolerate, because if the private sector did what government does, they'd go out of business.
Right.
But of course, government, as its nature, is a monopoly.
It seems like a really good time, and I know that's what a lot of what we're talking about here in Sacramento, as we're talking about the shortfall. That indeed, if we're going to go ahead and find ourselves, and oftentimes we're not cutting these governments, we're just giving them a little bit less than what they had anticipated. Right. And if we're going to do that, it seems like a perfect time to then help them stretch their dollars farther.
Absolutely.
And take advantage of saying, hey, listen, we're going to be able to, we're not going to give you as much as you thought you were going to get, but you know what? We're going to give you certain freedoms about how you spend your dollars so that you have greater choices and ability to get that dollar stretched in order to provide the services you need for your citizens.
Right. And I think one of the best budget strategies that we could adopt is if the governor and the Republicans got together and said, we are not going to raise taxes, you guys on the other side, this is how much money we've got coming in. You guys prioritize. I mean, that is the job of the legislature. That is under the purview of the California legislature to prioritize spending. And but every time they say, no, we need more revenue. They need more revenue when they get more revenue. They need more revenue when revenue is short. Under any scenario, they seem to be always asking for more dollars. And I think California taxpayers are getting very fed up with that.
Well, we had just, again, a ridiculous example of this. We had a bill this last week dealing with volunteers. You know, the idea, governor-sponsored bill, Senator Roy Ashburn was carrying the bill. It just basically said that we could use volunteers to work and to do some work around state parks.
Right.
To be able to do cleanup, to do those kinds of things. Right. Pretty simple issue. Right. Yet a bill like that couldn't even get out.
Well, it reminds me of a school district here in the Sacramento area where a bunch of the parents wanted to paint one of the school buildings, and the union went out and got a injunction against the parents from spending their time and money to paint a school building. I mean, this is getting ridiculous.
I had another example again in one of my school districts where they ended up closing some school libraries. So some parents said, hey, let us go in. We'll go ahead and volunteer and keep those libraries open.
Right.
Couldn't do it.
Couldn't do it.
Couldn't do it. The union said, oh, no, we don't want those parents. They're not trained.
So when these guys say it's for the children, I think we've called their bluff.
And I think that those are the kind of things that we need to be able to give those flexibilities to, because again, I think what happens is people what people want to talk about is how people are being hurt, and it's easier to tell that story than it is to try to figure out how to help.
Right.
And oftentimes it seems to me that we find that in our classrooms, and that's what is really amazing to me. We mentioned the fact that $11 billion to schools with 75,000 less students in them, and yet here we are talking about larger class sizes if we don't get this money, less music programs, we're going to have less art, we're going to have all these, overcrowded classrooms. And you got to say, well, where did the other $10 billion go then? Right. That was this new money when you had less students.
That's right.
And again, one of the things that we find is that so many of them are these, not only get sucked up into kind of administrative roles or bureaucratic roles, but also they just get sucked up into these unfunded mandates the state of California loves to give to local school districts.
Right. The categorical aid programs sucks up billions of dollars, and certainly a small rural school district doesn't need gang intervention if they don't have gangs.
Right, and categoricals are those dollars that sometimes we fund to schools, but we say, okay, we're going to give you some money, but here's how you have to spend it.
Exactly.
And, it's a kind of one-size-fits-all from Sacramento. Right. And some schools say, I just can't spend the money for those things, but yet we don't give them the ability then to prioritize those dollars for things that are more important.
Yeah, I would think that perhaps the school districts in South Central LA, their needs might be different than in Butte County or so.
And again, give them flexibility for that. I think that's I know that's one of the issues that we're talking about, wanting to give schools greater flexibility for the dollars that they do get. We have obviously one of the issues that is being talked about. The governor is now proposing and putting forth some of the issues in regards to spending caps, in regards to trying to restrain spending in order to stay within budget. What are some of your observations? We've had those discussions before. In fact, some of those have actually gone before the voters before.
Yes, at one time, in fact, in the wake of Proposition 13, there was the GAN spending limit. It was Proposition 4 in 1979. And that was the law for about 10 years, and it worked very effectively at restraining the growth and the size of government. And in fact, when Governor Duke Magian was governor, There was one year there was actually a rebate to taxpayers because there were taxes collected in excess of the spending limit. So taxpayers actually got a nice little refund. Unfortunately, subsequent initiatives like Prop 98 and others took that, pretty much gutted the GAN spending limit. But we need to go back and have what we consider some sort of structural discipline in spending. Say, government, you can spend next year what you spent this year, plus inflation and population increases, maybe some other modest adjustments, but there has to be some sort of spending restraint. Without it, well, we've seen the consequences.
And I think that's the challenge that we have. And I know for me, the challenge is that to try to get what we would think of as a kind of a locked up, foolproof way to do that, I get very nervous about, because there's some pretty crafty political folks up here who wink and say, yeah, this will do it. And then all of a sudden, a few years comes down and we're in the need, and somebody's, oops, we figured out a way to get around this issue.
Yeah, just about every single initiative ever passed by the people, the legislature finds a way to try to circumvent it. We've seen that with Prop 13. In fact, we've had to come back and close some of the loopholes that the legislature created. And the same is true of the spending limit. Drafting a workable spending limit is not easy. You have to make sure you define your revenues very carefully, and you have to define expenditures carefully, and then you try to smooth out the peaks and the valleys. It's not an easy process, but we need to try.
But some states have done it.
Some states have done it. Colorado has a very effective tax and expenditure limitation. Other states do, and they certainly don't have the problems that California does. And by the way, you and I both know that working Californians are moving out of the state. California's population is remaining stable because of immigration, both documented and undocumented, and new births. But unfortunately, our educated working people are leaving the state to the tune of 150,000 a year or higher, and that is a very troubling trend. And who's going to be left standing? One of the jokes that we say, the last taxpayers out of California, please turn off the lights.
Well, and in fact, we have our neighbor just to the east of us who's actually in a campaign right now, advertising to bring your California business to Nevada.
Don't blame them. Don't blame them.
And talking about some of the benefits of that. In fact, let's talk a little bit about that, because one of the issues that have been identified as a way to kind of create some additional revenue is to close tax loopholes. Now, when you hear the phrase tax loopholes, you're thinking about somebody who's shoveling away money in some account that they've got in the Cayman Islands or something.
Right.
And so they're not paying their fair share, and so you don't want to have tax cheaters out there, and so that's what you're trying to do. The list that they've come up with, though, in terms of tax loopholes are really focused not so much on that kind of tax issue. It's really on the everyday citizen of California.
Well, again, one person's loophole is another person's legitimate advancement of tax policy, not the least of which, of course, is the home mortgage interest deduction. I think most Californians would consider the ability to deduct their interest that they pay on their mortgage to be something that really helps them. And in fact, we're in a housing crisis here in California. That's the last thing you want to do, is to hurt housing, is to start taxing, removing that deduction. I do think that at least the policy of our organization has been, we're not arguing that the tax code must remain static. I mean, there may be some very minor tweaks that need to be done. Because
a little bit of that is just because of monetary processes and the changes as to how people earn money, keep money, trade money's traded, those kind of issues changes over time too.
Yeah, right, and any of these little tweaks should be done, we think, not for the purpose of raising revenue. If there's some true loophole that somebody's taking unfair advantage of, we can close that loophole, but there should be a tax reduction someplace else that helps average Californians. When these people talk about closing loopholes, they're talking about one thing: raising revenue. We should be able to have the discussion about whether or not our tax code makes sense, divorced from the issue of revenue increases. And the way you do that is you say, okay, we will put these things on the table, but we're going to cut taxes someplace else. Because otherwise, we've called their bluff. What they really want is to raise revenue.
Right, and that's really what this whole discussion is all about. It isn't about whether or not how do you get taxed or who do you tax. in much of the motivation. It's really the fact, this classic debate is does government have enough money or doesn't it have enough money?
Exactly.
And that really is what this is really all about. And
Right.
that is, there are those of us who say, hey, we think government has plenty of money.
Right.
Again, $150 billion more over the last 10 years since I've been here. That's a lot of money to be spending.
It is. It is. The revenue is there, and again, these loopholes they're talking about closing, things like the sales tax on diesel fuel for the agricultural community, those aren't my members, but I'll tell you, I don't want to pay more for food, and I think the agricultural community makes a good argument that that is a policy adopted by other states. Doesn't make sense to tax the fuel for tractors because they're not on the highways.
Yeah, they really fall into two categories. They fall into those that are targeted to try to help businesses expand and grow in California, such as those. Research and development tax credits in order to get folks to invest their money into programs and equipment in California in order to grow jobs. Right. Or on the other side, really just the kind of the family side, and that is your personal mortgage or your child deduction of your child.
Right.
Again, I just can't imagine that there's very many people watching out there who are saying, let me see, my home mortgage and the ability for me to get a tax credit on my children. I don't think those are tax loopholes in their mind. They don't think about the rich guy who's trying to save some money by using a Cayman Island account or something.
Exactly.
And I think, and we do those. A lot of times tax policy, we need to understand, we do because we want to use tax policy to help shape behavior.
Right. Generally speaking, I think it is part of the conservative philosophy to, over time, simplify the tax code. Mm-hmm. But what we would like to see is, if we're going to simplify it, also talk about reductions. Mm-hmm. The fact of the matter is, California has the highest income tax of all. It has the most progressive and highest rates of any state. We have some of the highest sales tax rates of any place in the nation. Only when it comes to property taxes, thanks to Prop 13, are we anywhere near moderation, and we're not low. We're about 25th out of 50. We're about very, very average. So California's overall tax climate is very hostile to both individuals and businesses, and we have already seen flight out of the state because of these bad policies. So if we do want to get tax simplification, one way to do it, if you want to do it, is to start reducing those taxes. Start flattening out the tax rate. You would see businesses started to reinvest in California.
Now, we found ourselves in kind of a similar situation back in the early 90s. And there was a point to where then Governor Wilson at that point kind of said, well, I guess we need some additional revenues. And he pushed through with a few Republican votes then a series of tax increases. How did that turn out?
Well, this shows you that static modeling of tax proposals doesn't work. Static modeling is you figure out how much money you need and you look at the current revenue and you apply a tax rate to that and you figure you're going to get $2 to $3 billion. Pete Wilson, as you know, managed to lose money by raising taxes.
Right.
And if ever there was a perfect example, a clear-cut evidence of supply-side economics, it was that example. We could have reinvigorated California's economy by cutting taxes, not raising taxes. And in fact, I'll give you another example. You talked about 1991. Back in 1978, when we had Prop 13, the other side said this was going to decimate local government, that it would implode California's economy. Well, right after Prop 13 passed, of course, in 1980, 81, 82, we had a booming economy. In fact, the tax revenues came in, made sure that local governments were not hurt and the state government was not hurt. So it was boom times when you cut taxes. Why? Because you give dollars. You keep dollars in people's pockets and they go out and stimulate the economy.
Well, and to this day right now, Governor Wilson will point back and say, we shouldn't have done that.
He does now say that was a mistake. And quite frankly, that is something that he told Governor Schwarzenegger right after the recall, that he should not raise taxes. And we are hoping that the governor is still heeding that advice. We're a little nervous about that.
The challenge that the executive has and the legislature has, and that is it's hard to make a won't raise tax commitment at the same time you don't make a I won't increase spending commitment.
That is correct.
And that's really the jam that we find ourselves in right now. It isn't that our revenues are falling off since the governor has been elected. Our problem is that we forgot the other side of that formula.
That's right.
And that is to control spending in this process.
That's right. That's right. And over-reliance on boom times. We have seen these cycles over and over and over again, and we don't plan for the down times, and we know they're coming. We know they're coming, and we simply don't plan for it.
Well, I was talking to one of the press dealing with the governor, and they were saying, has the governor broken his promise? Is he talking about these tax loopholes? Is he going backwards on those? I said, the problem I think for the governor is that he just forgot the other side of the issue. It got more complicated for him. He really has a strong commitment of not raising taxes. The problem is he didn't understand the consequences of not controlling spending, because ultimately, that's where I get concerned about whatever the legislature does in order to control spending or cap spending. We end up doing that only because we don't have a strong executive who's willing to say no.
Right.
Because that really is the best way to do it. I can remember back in the mid-'90s, after that time, last few years of Governor Wilson, there were a couple of whole spending bills that the governor during budget time just vetoed the whole thing.
Yep.
Sent it back, said, no, I'm not going to do this. I want these things. And that kind of strong leadership, it seems to me, is really what we need to be having right now.
And I thought the Governor Duke Majan also displayed very good leadership in budgetary times by saying, telling the legislature, send me a balanced budget, send me a balanced budget. I remember when there was an impasse back in the Duke Majan administration, and we ultimately got some spending discipline, but it was, it is difficult, and you need someone who is able to stand before the tax and spend lobby, which is able to bring their forces to bear with much more efficient powers than our side. The problem, as you and I both know, is that our side is just the taxpayers. It's a very diffuse interest. Our people are out working. They have their soccer games. It's very difficult to get our people to Sacramento to testify. In fact, we do know that the number of lobbyists lobbying for additional spending outnumber those calling for reduced spending by about 100 to 1. But if you go 20 miles in any direction from the Capitol and start talking to ordinary people, they don't want higher taxes.
Well, that's why when we were going through one of these debates in one of our committees, and they were talking about the additional dollars, I said, why don't you guys just put that on the ballot?
Yeah.
Go ahead and get some signatures. If you think this is what Californians want, go ahead, get your signatures out there and give it to Californians, and let them decide how they want to increase their taxes.
Right. The tax receivers, because their interests are far more narrow, are able to bring those people to the legislative hearings. And the general diffuse interest of the taxpayers, we don't have that capability, but we do have the knowledge in the focus groups and the polling that we do. People do not want higher taxes. The last round of tax increases were soundly rejected by the California voters. Proposition 56, which would have lowered the vote threshold for increased taxes, was resoundingly defeated. So I think you and I both know that the voters are in the right place.
Absolutely. Thank you, John,
You're very
much.
welcome.
And again, hope that was a great discussion that you could be a part of as we talk about the challenges facing us. It is going to be, I think, a very long summer up here in Sacramento, and it's going to be that debate. Do we have enough money or don't we have enough money? I can tell you that I believe government has enough money. It's how we spend your tax dollars that needs to be the focus of this discussion. Thanks for joining us this evening.
For more information in the Antelope Valley, 661-729-6232. In Victorville, 760-843-8414. In Santa Clarita, 661-286-1471. Or you can visit him online. Thank you for watching Capital Ideas.